Welcome back to the plenary session of the symposium, and I think most of you will be happy to hear my voice, actually. Before I pass the floor to Stefan and Harro, I want to give my ultra-short summary of my opening speech, which is basically to welcome you to our symposium and to share with you how incredibly happy I am that we are with so many here now on this platform. Talking about the futuring of classical music, futuring as a verb, and the future is something we want to make, we have to make together. And I will share my opening remarks through the chat so you can read them. And maybe just to remind you of some of the practical issues I also mentioned that I want to underline is that the platform really offers some interesting networking features. And so you can contact delegates individually. If you go to the main area and you click on the people button, you will see all the delegates. You can send them messages, arrange meetings. In addition to that, you can also arrange your own lounges. So you can set up with people you want to meet your own lounge. And to do so, you have to go to the help desk in the symposium. And this is the first lounge. When you see the overview of the lounges, this is where you can find the help desk and where the people can help you to set up your own lounge. Having said that, I give the floor to Stefan, Rosu, and Harro, who will continue with the keynote speech.
Thank you, Peter. My name is Stefan Rosu. I'm CEO and Artistic Director of the Philharmonie Zuid-Nederland. And together with many others, we try to make the MCICM possible. I have the pleasure now to introduce Harro van Lente, who is our first keynote speaker in this symposium. He will talk about producing futures and how futures matter in the present. The keynote speech in this case will have two parts, and after the first part of approximately 18 minutes, there is a opportunity to pose a few questions, so please use the chat function for that. And after the second part, there will be a discussion table in the lounges, and the lounge is called Continue the Keynote Discussion, and Harro will be there, and if there's further discussion and questions, it's possible there. So let me, before Harro takes the floor, just shortly introduce him. Harro is a full professor of science and technology studies at the Maastricht University, head of department at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. He is one of the founding fathers of something called sociology of expectations, which was new for me, I have to say. It's a study that shows how representations of the future shape current socio-technical developments. He has published an enormous amount of articles, and he is recipient of the East Freeman Award 2018 for a book, Emerging Technologies for Diagnosing Alzheimer's Disease, Innovating with Care. So I think we will not have to deal with Alzheimer here in our case, but innovating with care. So Harro, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will share my screen with practice. So this should be okay now. Is that okay? Good. Yes. So I will. Okay, good. I will inform you about some experiences I had in the past about thinking about the future, and I will show how futures matter in the present. And this is then also a sort of invitation to think along those lines. And as it was announced, I will have two parts in my talk. Part one is first showing that futures are not innocent and that they do things and that you should care about them and that you should not have others develop them. The second part is to show how you could produce futures and what kind of techniques there are. Maybe some are inspiring for you now. Okay, so I will start with part one, and that is from the world of engineers and firms. That is where I started my sociology of expectations, and in which I still walk around often. And I find this a very interesting ecology to study and to be amongst. And if you are there, then you really are impressed with how competitive it is. And that technology is just one of the weapons, but also the battlefield itself. And there is constantly a battle for innovation. Innovation is the thing to be achieved, but also to outrace the others. And it's a collective achievement. It's something that everybody acknowledges as it cannot be done alone, not even within a firm. Firms also need each other. And so you create all kinds of interdependencies. And this all creates, together with a very turbulent environment, a lot of uncertainty. And so this is the world in which engineers and firms have to operate. They have to make decisions. They have to decide what to invest, what to investigate, where to put the money, where to find the markets, what kind of technologies they need, what kind of supply chain, what kind of materials to use, what kind of knowledge base to expand. So it's very important for all of them, but it's also very uncertain. And still, they have to make decisions. So while they are engineers and economists, they cannot calculate what is the most rational, what is the best way to go forward, because there are too many uncertainties. And these cannot be calculated because of the interdependencies. What they do matters for others, and they know that it matters for others, and others will depend their decisions on what they do. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and one of the striking ways to cut through that is to follow promises, technological promises, but also promises about new markets or promises about new knowledge bases that you could use. So that is the sort of starting point of the world of engineers and firms. And I think it's probably quite remote from your own daily experience, but you will have heard about this. And an excursion into a foreign world is sometimes very helpful, as you will know if you have done some trips on your own. The thing that you find in this world of engineers and firms is that futures are everywhere. So you will find a lot of claims about, say, cities of the future and what it means for the modes of transportation, for the way people live, for their education, for their governance, all kinds of claims about all kinds of futures that you find. And well, they end up in newspapers, so this is something that everybody will notice at some point. And these futures are not just in claims about, say, a CEO saying, well, we invest in this. It's also actions. If the government is investing, say, 1 billion euros in biotechnology, this is a future that is then pronounced, and the future that is then taken a part in. So the action is a sort of future as well. Then we have all kinds of stories about what is happening in society, where we come from, where we go to, what is happening in China, what is happening in the US, and how we should relate to it. So there are all kinds of dramas that we find, and these dramas are then shaping the future as well. The future can also come to us in all kinds of graphs, and I give just one example of the various sources for the future. You see solar and wind becoming much more important. So these pictures, they are abundantly present in discussions, in publications, in conferences, in decision-making in firms and research institutes. So the future is there everywhere. And it's not just stories and graphs, it's also artifacts. So if you look at the picture of the car, that's not just a picture of a car, it's also a statement about this is how the future will be. This is what we invest in. So in this case, it's Volkswagen showing how an electric car could be part of the future. And it's also a statement of how they invest in it and how they are trying to colonize that future. I have made some study of how all these futures shape the present. And I come to three main things that they do. They are not innocent. That is my main claim here. They are not innocent. They do things. One of the things they do is they protect. So you could see it as a harsh environment that is killing all kinds of initiatives. But if you have promises, then there could be some legitimation for funding. If you have a nice sounding future, then people might invest in you. They might believe you. They might give you credibility. And that is something that is always needed. Whenever you would like to start something, you have to make some promising future. It's also in policies that you have to account for what you did. Why did you invest in biotechnology? Well, it's the future. Okay, so then it's acknowledged as a good decision, maybe. So you need those futures to arena, and not just in policy making, but also within firms. There is a political arena there as well. And if you would like to start a project somewhere, you always need future to broadcast and to support your own ideas. I think you recognize this because this is not just science and technology, it's also in all kinds of other domains of life. When you write a proposal, you need a shining future that helps you there. And the interesting thing is that sometimes I noticed that it is not necessary that everybody believes this future, this promise. It could be that people then think, well, I would like to run this project because then I can show, for instance, well, for all kinds of reasons, to show off to my father that I finally am able to run a project on my own. So I relate to this shining future. And also within the board or the CEO, they might think, well, I do not really believe this, but the shareholders, they really want us to invest in, say, biotechnology. So therefore, I grant you this project. And also the shareholders may not even believe it, but they know, well, everybody is investing in it, so it would be silly if we are not doing that. So there is, there is a sociology here, not so much a psychology of the future. And the sociology may be that it works even when nobody really believes in it, whatever that could mean. So there's some perversity as well. The second thing that futures do is to guide. So as I said, successes cannot be calculated, so you have to resort to other shortcuts, and promising futures are a shortcut. They help to make you decide for a direction. And so they work as rules of thumb. So if you're not sure what to do, you can follow a shining future. So they work like heuristics, as it is called in studies of how professionals work. They follow rules of thumb, and futures are one of them. And what you also see is that on a collective level, everybody is doing that you have strange phenomena, like everybody being afraid of missing the boat, or that arguing that the train is unstoppable, so it's useless not to fuel the train anymore because it's unstoppable anyhow. And so everybody is running for the same thing. And if you look at innovation policies in most countries, they all have the same issues there. It's all about quantum technology, nanotechnology, biotechnology, and ICT. And the interesting thing is here that if nobody would be afraid of missing the boat, there would be no boat to miss. It's just by the fear that the boats are created, so to speak. So the futures really matter. And the last part that I would like to share with you is coordination. So futures, if you think about all these stories about future cities, about future mobility, about future energy, they are like stories, and they have a plot, and there are protagonists. People are part of those stories. And if you are confronted with that, then I see that engineers and firms and economists and policymakers, they take a position, and they see that others take a position. They see what Japan is doing. They see what Philips is doing and Shell. And because that is happening, they also feel forced to take a position themselves in the story. So what is happening is this mutual positioning. So actors position each other, and they feel that that they are bound to do so. And if you do so, then you see a role for yourself in this future. So if there is a future of green cities with a lot of trees and a lot of bicycle paths, then you could say, well, we are good at these bicycle paths, so that is our part in this future. And then we hope that others will bring other elements of this future city. We are good at smart solutions, so we develop the apps for the smartphones there. So there will be all kinds of statements, and people are then listening carefully what others are doing and derive from that unfolding story what they should do, and that builds another chapter to this story. So there is a mutual positioning, and it makes the future even more robust. So in that sense, it's an intriguing way in which all these developments unfold, and it does not start with some problem or needs. It really starts with some visions of the future in which people see possibilities to be part of. There is one extreme example that I would like to share with you as a sort of role model of how futures matter, and this is very, very well known, but still good to have a look at that. That is the famous Moore's law in the development of computer chips. And Moore's law is named after Mr. Moore, who in 1965, and he was director of Fairchild, so one of the first laboratories working with integrated circuits, so making a circuit in a chip. And he said in 1965, well, I see some developments, and probably in 10 years' time, we will have an annual increase of possibilities of twice the size as what we had before. So it's a doubling every 2 years. That was his statement. A doubling of possibilities every 2 years. So that is an exponential growth. And if you have that then in a logarithmic scale, so you see that in this graph, you will see it's a straight line. So it's doubling every year indeed. And that didn't stop in 1975. It continued. So it has been governing the production of computer chips for the last half century. This is really amazing. And because it's so amazing, it has been labeled as Moore's law, as if it was a natural law, like we have Newton's law or the law of gravity, which existed before it was pronounced by Mr. Newton. We had gravity, and it worked according to some logic. So people also say, well, this is the logic that belongs to technology, and we see it with computer chips. But if you look carefully, it's rather a story of futures, and futures being forceful. So what happened that this prediction acted as a rule in the game. So if you were a producer of computer chips, you really had to look carefully at this prediction, because then you could know where to be in 2 to 5 or 10 years time, so you could accommodate your investments to this projection. And that means that it's not so much that Moore's law was correct and therefore it happened. No, it's a prediction that started off a strategic game amongst producers of computer chips, and they looked at others and they looked at their own investments to see whether they were still following this pattern. And if not, then they feared they could be out of the game and it was over. So they had so many investments in this to keep this happening. And because it was happening all the time, it was seen as something that could not be avoided. So it's something as like a prison in which you cannot escape, because you have to follow it. And this is known in sociology as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So a prophecy that sets off all kinds of activities and responses that makes this prophecy then also happen. Okay, to summarize, my first part of this keynote, in which I argue that when you look at the world of engineers and firms, you have maybe some fresh takes on what futures do. Because in the first place, you will see that futures are not something only on the Friday night at the drinks. It's something that is from day one, Monday morning, you start with futures. And they are present in all kinds of ways, in stories, graphs, artifacts. And secondly, I argued that futures are not innocent. They do things. It's not just a matter of just wait and see whether they are true or not. If they are there, and they are there, they do things and they shape the present. They provide legitimation, they provide guidance, they provide coordination, and that leads to all kinds of outcomes in which people can be a prisoner. There's not so much freedom there. And well, it's not always a prison, so Moore's law is an extreme case, but still there are all kinds of effects, and I hope I have somehow made you sensitive for this, and I'm welcoming all kinds of questions on this first part. So I am ready to take some questions.
Thank you, Harro. To our participants, I have to say that I can't see the questions at the moment here, so I start with a question of my own. Storytelling, in a way, if I understand you right, Harro, is very important. The kind of stories which are produced in terms of how can the future look like have a direct impact on expectations and actually also how the future will look like, probably. If we look to the classical music sector, one of the stories which is told is our public is aging and we will die. Is there a similar example in the field of your expertise, where you say, well, this is a sort of negative prediction which had an impact on how the future for that sector actually looked like? And second, is there an example how a sector coped with such a negative prediction?
Yes, well, there are the world of technological innovation is full of those stories of technologies in decline, and also so think about the death of the typewriter, which was replaced by the personal computer. And it's not so much that the typewriter did not function anymore, that it was working as ever, but it was seen as something of the past, and it was not seen as something you could invest in, and so it became a token of backwardness. But still, it had worked pretty well for many years. So And what you see is that, and that happened to many technological innovations. And what you see that then it is reduced to a niche market. So where only a few people then are still enjoying this. So like the niche for LPs, long playing records, that's now a market for niche market for those who really enjoy those old-fashioned techniques, but also it still works. And so that is, so that is the risk that it becomes a niche only. But there are also examples that it's reversed. So bicycles were seen as something that was of the past because they were not as fast as cars. But now you see a reversal of cities being built around bicycles, and bicycles as really the mobility of the future, because it's so much more efficient and so much more sustainable, and also so much more friendly for cities. And so so there are possibilities to revive stories about technologies and to make them part of other stories. But you need other stories there. It's not just that you say the bicycle is on the second thought, well, maybe it is good. No, you should connect it to stories about cities and how mobility there is organized. So I think that could be a lesson also for classical music. It's not just about music, it's also about, well, what kind of life are we living and how does it connect to that?
Mm-hmm. Harro, I have a question from Malon, and she says, Moore's law was a future laid down by an expert as a prediction. To what extent do you see futures as contested spaces and subject to public debates? And how do the dynamics of these debates continually shape and alter these futures?
Yeah, so indeed, so Moore's law is an extreme case, and it's not holding because Mr. Moore was so sharp and he was an expert. It's holding because it became part of a strategic game. But the normal situation is that futures are contested, indeed. So if you think about nuclear energy or wind power or biotechnology or all kinds of life science technologies, they are contested, and not just for the consequences, but also whether they indeed will deliver all their promises or not. So that indeed it's important that there is discussions about all these promises, because if you are not questioning them, they will have their forceful effects and they will be seen as the next step. And so that is what I find intriguing, but also worrisome about firms and engineers, is that they are obsessed by the future. And there is so much the idea that there will be a next step, there will be a follow-up, there will be a next television, there will be a next smartphone. And then the question is, what is it? And if you know it, and when you feel that could be the one, then everybody jumps on this. So there is such a wasteful way of dealing with all these things. And then as a sort of a side effect, there will be some progress, but that is the thing that started it off in the first place. It's this uncertainty and this eagerness to jump on the bandwagon. And so I hope that somehow answers the question about contestations.
I'm sure you did. There's a question from Imogen, and she's asking, so how can we learn to develop better future narratives? And I think that is a sort of bridge to your second part of your presentation. So looking at the time, I would ask you to go to the second part of your presentation, please.
Yeah, I will. But I will add one more remark on that, because I find this is really important. I really would like to see that, like we have discussions about what is a good book or a theater play, and we have parts of our newspapers devoted to these questions or ways of assessing that. We don't have that so much of futures, of technological futures. What are good futures and how to assess them? we just imagine that they are produced somewhere and that will be that. But there are so much more some democratic ways of dealing with it, and we should see it as something like, well, literary fiction to relate to. Okay, I will go to my part 2, how to produce futures, and also inspired again by this world of firms and engineers, because there futures are not just happening, they are actually produced, and this could also inspire maybe this audience who was not so obsessed by the future, I guess, as engineers and firms are, but still, you should relate to it. Because, well, this is my invitation, maybe also warning. So if you consider that futures are everywhere and shape the present, it's better to enter that game. Otherwise, others will present your future, and it's too important to delegate it to engineers and economists. Okay, but still, what do they do? How do they produce futures? There are 5 basic forms that I will sketch for you that could inspire you. So one is the extrapolations, where you follow trends. Second one is where you follow experts. That is called the Delphi method. There is a method following surveys, where you follow responses of relevant audiences. There is a method on models, where you make simulations of the field that you would like to predict. And finally, scenarios, where you follow some extreme cases of the future that are then needed to make your strategy robust. I will go through these now one by one and give as well. So the classic way of producing futures, and also the commonsensical way, is extrapolation, where you see a trend and you just imagine it will continue. And that could be in a linear way or exponential, where it still grows every day, say, doubling in 1 year or in 10 years. And everybody is doing this more or less in a commonsensical way, but we also know that it's also quite difficult really to uphold in many cases. There's this nice cartoon that I came across where you could extrapolate how many husbands someone would have who's just married, and saying, as you can see, by late next month, you'll have over 4 dozen husbands. Better get a bulk rate on wedding cake. Now that is, of course, you need to know the context to see whether the extrapolation makes sense or not. In this case, it's nonsensical. The second way to produce futures is by using the insights of experts of a field. So if you would like to know what is the future of primary schools, you just go to the experts, of the teachers themselves, of the academics studying primary schools, and then you have several rounds. So first you would make your assumptions and key questions. Then you go to the experts one by one and collect their responses on what is happening. How do you see the future? Then there is a first Delphi round, so where the experts sit together and reflect on the findings. And then you have a sort of second order reflection, because you see what all the others have said. So you would get an intermediate summary, and then you could get a second Delphi round, where you re-examine what everybody has said and what it means. And then you could have the last expert round reflecting on that. So in several circles, and there are different variations on this, but the basic thing is that you rely on the intimate knowledge of all the intricacies and the complexities of the field of study. So in your case, classical music, you would go to the experts. You have to define who the experts are, and then you will get some intricate knowledge about possible and likely futures. There's also surveys where you rely on marketing and asking people what they would do in the future. So I came across something on streaming music and how much people would be willing to pay. So that gives you an indication whether it's a likely future or not, and for what kind of audiences. So in this picture on the left, you see that the younger people are, the more they are willing to spend on it. So that says something about the various parts of music that have a future in this way. And on the right, you see something of the more elaborate and more sophisticated ways of doing this, where you have a segmentation of your audiences. And in the Netherlands, Motivaction is very famous for doing this. They have all kinds of ways of depicting and clustering citizens. And one central way is by distinguishing, on the one hand, the income, and the status, so high status, low status, and on the other hand, the orientation, whether the orientation is more looking to conservation or looking to more progressive and postmodern ways of doing this. In this case, you see 5 different groups, where you have postmodern Nora on the upper right corner. She is more interested in experiences and experimenting, whereas Mary, traditional, on the other hand, is really keen on preserving things as they are and not tinkering with those, and so on. So these are different ways in which you could explore it. And in marketing, there has been quite a extensive experience with doing all this, and it's fascinating to read. And it's, well, again, one of those things that could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, because people might relate to postmodern Nora, because that sounds interesting. Okay, I will leave with this. It's an intriguing way of doing that, but it costs money. The other one is maybe less useful for classical music, but I still mention it here because it's very well elaborated, and you will find all kinds of examples in newspapers, on CBS, and all kinds of bureaus that predictions on economic systems for the future. What they do is they have a sort of representation of something, of field. They model a system, and they define variables and all kinds of dependencies, and with algorithms, you can relate them to each other, and they could make several runs. And I injected something that is now hitting us every day, all these projections on how many people will be infected. So this is a very optimistic scenario where people are then being infected only during several months, and then it's over, then everybody is recovered. And it's so we see these futures on a daily basis now, and it's something that that takes some mathematical skills, but it's interesting because you can play with them, and you can change variables and adapt the dependency. So it's an interesting way to tinker with it. The last way I find the most interesting, and I think it's also useful for you to try out somehow, that is scenario building. And it's traditionally, you see the Shell logo there, related to the headquarters of Shell, who have invested in this way of dealing with the future. And there is some, there is a story, and it's still a contested story, but that Shell was investing in this way of dealing with the future, and that they were able to cope with the oil crisis in the 1970s, whereas the others were still in the old-fashioned extrapolations. They were able to relate to different futures, and to extremely different futures, so that they would assess the robustness of their strategies in the face of those different futures, those different scenarios. And this is the way you build them. So first you sit down and you think, what are the drivers? What are the different forces here? And that could be of all kinds. So what's happening in culture and in technologies, and you just make an enormous list of them. Then you select 2 of them, namely the 2 who are having the most impact on the field and are the most uncertain. So sometimes the impact on the field is very big. For instance, that China will be a big player, but it's not uncertain. It's almost certain that China will be a big player. So that's not a driver. So you pick the 2 drivers, and they can be very different, but you pick the 2 with the most impact and the most uncertainty. And if you have those, then you make 2 axes orthogonal to each other. So you have 4 corners, and these 4 corners have 4 futures, which are extremely different. I will give you an example in a minute. The point is, if you have these extremely different futures, you can test your strategy in all kinds of ways. You can test whether they hold in those 4 different situations. And to make it more lively and more helpful to deal with it, you create narratives for those 4 corners. And in those narratives, you can use the drivers that you have collected in the first place. So what is happening and what kind of social forces do we have and how would they look like in this case? What would education be? What would regulation be? What about finance? So everything is different in those 4 different worlds or scenarios. And finally, you have nice names for those scenarios so that everybody can relate to them quickly. I did a quick and dirty example for you. Just last night, I thought, well, let's try it out. Collected some drivers, and there are many more. So streaming technologies are there. And I know in this conference, people have been. So what does that mean? You will have cities competing with each other. Who has the best music halls? And you see young people, whether they are not contemplating a music career, what kind of music. The rise of shaming flying and city trips as something that is not well to do. Or the rise of awareness on heritage and that we should take care of that. Or China doing outplaying and really training a lot of musicians. So all kinds of drivers, and I thought, well, most impactful, most uncertain, I don't know, but I just take a pick. So for instance, classical music will be mainly in music halls, or classical music will be mainly through streaming. And the second driver could be that classical music is mixed with other art forms or is not mixed with other art forms. So if you have those 2 drivers, you get those 2 axes. So music hall versus streaming and mixed versus non-mixed. And then you can invent scenarios. So for instance, the scenario reviving the past, I just gave a fancy name, where the music hall and music only is embraced as something we should care about, something that needs a place in our culture, that's something we cherish, and that has a future as something of reviving the past. A second future would be that this is all over, that it's all streaming, and that classical music becomes a convenience commodity, and people rather prepare for that in terms of how it is recorded, how people are trained, how they sell it, how the packages are made, and so on. A third scenario would be that it's streaming but mixed with other art forms, so a sort of total experience with virtual experience of people at home experimenting and buying all kinds of total experiences that are then mixed with other art forms. So it's not just classical music, but also visual and maybe even touch or whatever. And the last one would be where it would still be music halls, but then classical music would be part of cities competing with each other, events competing with each other, where it's not just music, but also other art forms entering the scene, being part of what is offered. And well, that would be a new battleground and a new area to explore. So all these 4 scenarios are in principle possible. And yeah, so that is something you could relate to. It's a way of creating futures. Okay, I conclude. And that is, well, it's really an invitation or a media command, maybe, thou shalt produce futures. Because what I said is in the first part that futures are there and they're shaping the present, so we should enter this game. And it's too important to delegate that to engineers and economists. It's also a role for others, like people studying and performing classical music. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harro, for this extremely interesting presentation, short and very interesting and intriguing. I invite everyone now to choose a group where to continue the discussion. And before you do that, I would like to say that what we experience now in this session is exactly what the original idea of the MCICM is about, and that is that someone who is not super familiar with the classical music field, with his scientific glasses on, looks at the classical music fields and, you know, gives some sort of idea of what could be done and how we could be made adaptable for the future. So in that respect, Harro, many, many thanks. And again, oh, one more thing. We see us tomorrow at, what is it? I have to look at my papers. 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock on the same channel, half an hour of possibility to chat with everyone. At 2:30, there's a recap of the day. And then we have the second keynote from someone who actually is from the field and will try to do a similar thing, a view on the future. So thank you for joining. Thank you for your attention. And we see us later in the rooms. Thank you, Harry.
Yeah. Goodbye.